Relaxes the mood too.
Yeah, I've gone ahead and started it. All right. Looks like we've got participants coming in. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, as always. We have quite a global audience for these webinars, and so I have to make sure to mention all the time zones here. What I would love to do is if you can put a yes in the chat if you can see me and you can hear me and you can see the slides on your screen. Lots of yeses. Excellent. That sounds great. The next thing I would love to see in the chat is your location. And I would love to see something meaningful that happened to you this week. Either that happened to you or that you did for someone, something meaningful that happened in your life this week. We like asking that question occasionally. It's fun to see what's going on in people's lives as we meet together every once in a long while. Germany, Ireland, Alberta, Lithuania.
Lithuania.
I think that's a first from Lithuania. So welcome, Lithuania. Thank you for being here. Madison, Wisconsin, New Zealand, Long Island, Massachusetts, Munich, London. Helped my daughter with 5 family members with COVID.
Oh wow.
It's a time of that, isn't it?
Hope you're getting better.
I had a random stranger from a company I was interested in respond on LinkedIn and offer a phone call to connect. Christina, we hosted LGBTQ plus STEM Day virtually yesterday in New Mexico. Philadelphia, made a career change and left my role as it was clear that dissenting opinions were not welcomed. Allison, we're going to talk a little bit about that today.
Yes, we are.
Chesapeake, Virginia, Chicago, Hampshire, England, Dallas, Texas. Luke, starting a new term of programming with high school students around personal and professional development. We need more of that these days.
Yeah, we do.
Don't we?
Barcelona,
Brazil, Dublin,
Montreal,
Singapore.
Guayaquil, Ecuador.
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 Mucho gusto. Bienvenidos. Yo viví en Ecuador por 2 años. For my Ecuadorians. Excellent. Well, welcome everybody to another Leader Factor webinar. If you're joining us for the second or the third or the 12th time, welcome back. If it's your first time with us, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you. We do these webinars usually every 2 or 3 weeks. And the last dozen or so have been around psychological safety and emotional intelligence. Today, we're going to be talking about psychological safety again. And we're very privileged to have with us today's host, Dr. Timothy Clark. He is the author of the book, The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety, that was released just earlier this year. So this is a burgeoning topic. It hasn't been around for too long in any really sort of serious fashion. And so this book has helped push the concept to the next level. And we're excited to have Dr. Clark with us. He's the founder and the CEO of our organization, Leader Factor. And he's a Fulbright and British research scholar, or was at Oxford. He's an Oxford-trained social scientist, and he's been doing instrument design and research in this space for several decades. And so we're excited to have him with us today to gain some insight from him. He comes from academia, but has a long history of practice. And so it's really neat to be able to blend those 2 worlds. So Tim, welcome. And I think with that, I'll kick it over to you. But before I do, just a couple housekeeping items. So feel free to participate as much as you would like in the chat. The chat is always super rich. So go ahead and be as involved as possible in the chat. This entire session is going to be recorded and sent out to you afterward. So if you have to miss a part of it, or you're taking notes, don't worry. You'll have access to this after the webinar. Usually we'll send it out a day or 2 after. If you haven't had an opportunity to pick up the book, we would encourage you to do that and leave us a review on Amazon. We passed our goal last time with the webinar, and so that was really exciting. We'd encourage you to do that. And then last thing I'll mention, I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but we just opened up a few sessions for Q1 of 2021 for the 4 stages certification and the EQometer certification. So if you go to leaderfactor.com/certifications, you can learn a little bit more about that. I'll have Ben throw a link in the chat. So with that, Tim, I'll kick it over to you to talk us through our agenda today.
Thanks, Junior. And I want to acknowledge Junior as our co-host. We're going to tag team this today, and hopefully we're going to have fun, and hopefully we're going to generate insights for all of us to take back to our jobs and our roles in our organizations. So we have a 3-part agenda. Number one, we're going to talk about punished versus rewarded vulnerability. Two, we're going to go briefly over the 4 stages of psychological safety, and then we're going to focus the balance of the time will be dedicated to focusing on 7 ways to invite intellectual bravery. Now, this webinar is really based on the article that we published just a few days ago in the Harvard Business Review titled, this is a screenshot of that article, "To Foster Innovation, Cultivate a Culture of Intellectual Bravery." So what does that mean? What does intellectual bravery mean? And how do you foster that in the culture? So we're going to talk about that. To get started, we want to begin with a couple of polling questions. So Junior, if you could bring us the first polling question. We want to grab a little bit of data and then reflect it back to you. Here's the first question. In a team setting, which of these 4 activities do most team members want to do first? Go ahead and answer that question, and then we'll show you the results. And the reason we want to ask you this question is we want to show you a universal pattern. So the 4 stages of psychological safety is based on a universal pattern based on global survey research. And we want to validate that and show it to you so that you can realize that this is not somebody's opinion, right?
All right. If you haven't voted, get in there. I'll keep it open for about 5 more seconds and then we'll close it out.
Okay.
All right, here we go. I will share the results.
Fantastic. So again, in a team setting, which of these 4 activities do most team members want to do first? As you can see, and you validated the universal pattern, most human beings in social settings, they want to connect with other team members first. That's the first priority. And the data supports this in every single survey that we've done. And here's yet another example. So I want you to think about how important this is in terms of the sequence of natural human needs and what people are looking for. Okay, fantastic.
And
Let's
Tim,
go. Yeah.
I want to call out just the diversity of the audience and the global nature of the audience. And that's something that is really important to understand. If you look through the chat, you'll see all the geographies represented. And I'm sure many, many industries, nonprofit, healthcare, government, higher ed, we're across the board, right? We represent virtually everything, any capacity that someone could have. And so I think that that's important to call out because across cultures, across industries, across demographics and generations, you see this pattern over and over and over again.
It's an unmistakable pattern. Let's go to the second question. We just have 2 here.
Let me get to the second and we'll go ahead and launch.
Here's the second question, everyone. In a team setting, which of these 4 activities is the highest risk? Which is the highest risk activity? And again, as Junior pointed out, we're drawing from an extremely global audience, especially today. It's quite extraordinary. We pretty much have every continent represented. Which of these 4 activities is the highest risk activity of the 4?
All right, I'll go ahead and end and share.
Okay,
check
there you
this
go.
out.
Yeah. So this pattern is even more unmistakable. And again, it's a global universal pattern. So of these 4 activities, challenging the status quo carries the highest risk. So again, think about what Junior just said. Across cultures, across nations, across demographics, when you're doing this, you are at the highest level of personal vulnerability and risk, right? So think about this as it relates to psychological safety and intellectual bravery, which we're going to get into. Okay, fantastic. Okay, we can take that down. And so let's move into a discussion about vulnerability. I want you to think about vulnerability in a social setting, on a team, in an organization. So most of the time, when human beings go into a social setting, the first thing they're concerned about is whether vulnerability is rewarded or punished. They're observing, they're perceiving, they're looking around, trying to figure out, if I engage in an act of vulnerability, what happens, right? What happens to me? What will happen? And they're trying to predict that based on what they see. Will it be rewarded? Will it be punished? Now, let me ask you a question, and this is for everyone. Go to your chat. What are some basic acts of vulnerability that we engage in as we interact in a social setting? What are some everyday basic acts of vulnerability? What would we be looking for to know if we engage in an act of vulnerability, if it'll be punished or rewarded? What are we looking for?
David saying, asking questions. Oscar, when we fail at something. Francine, share our mental well-being status. Ask for help. Sharing personal information. Sharing your opinion. Just saying you don't feel well. Nancy, that's good. Mary, open
Really good.
body language.
Yeah.
Danny saying, I'm not sure the answer to that. That sure is, right? Keith, generally, authenticity. I think that that's completely true, and that encompasses a lot of what this means.
Yeah.
Asking for help. Sorry, I made a mistake. Sharing ideas. Admitting you're wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's important to understand so many of these are simple. We're not really talking about going out on a limb. An act of vulnerability could simply be introducing yourself,
Yeah.
right? Because you're putting yourself out there and just saying, hey, I'm Junior, right?
Yeah.
And hope that there's some sort of reciprocity. Even that is an act of vulnerability.
Yeah, it really is. So I hope that we can all see how common, how these are everyday examples of acts of vulnerability. So when you're trying to figure out, right, if vulnerability is rewarded or punished, what are you doing? You're engaging in what we call threat detection. And you're looking around at these very acts of vulnerability that you've mentioned to see what happens next. What is the response to that act of vulnerability? If based on your analysis, you think you're in a safe place, then you will likely engage in that act of vulnerability. That's a performance response. You think it's safe, you'll lean in, you'll engage, you'll contribute. If on the other hand, you look around and you see that these same acts of vulnerability are being punished, and the punishment could be subtle, it could be mild, and it could range all the way to being very aggressive and destructive and overt, right? But that's how you're going to come to your conclusion. You're going to do that threat detection. So depending on your conclusion, you're going to go into offensive mode or a defensive mode. Let me ask you a couple of questions. What does an offensive response look like? If you feel that acts of vulnerability are being rewarded, you'll go into an offensive mode of performance. What does that look like? What do people do when they feel that they can engage in acts of vulnerability? Go to your chat. What does that look like? An
Asking
offensive
more questions, being curious, increased trust. Brian says contribution of some kind. Sarah says increased creativity, sharing ideas, learning and growth, learning from mistakes. Don't we want all of these things? Innovation, openness, engagement. You take more risks. There's positive energy. You contribute more. Open, honest, and candid. Eye contact, stepping into the unknown, creativity, intellectual bravery. There you go.
There we go.
Leaning in,
Yeah.
build connection, diverse views.
So I want you to think about, for those of you that come from a corporate environment, I want you to think about the business impact of this, right? At an individual level, we determine if acts of vulnerability are rewarded or punished, and then we act accordingly. Well, what is the train of consequences? What are the implications? They're profound. They lead to business impact, right? Either negative or positive. Okay, if you go into a defensive mode and a defensive response, what does that look like? What is your posture? What is your behavior? What do you do?
You clam up, says Mark. Raymond, justify your actions. You get shut down.
Yeah,
You don't speak. Silence. Look at how much silence is in here.
yeah.
Silence, silence, quiet,
Avoidance.
silence.
Yeah,
Keep the status quo. Productivity goes down. You make excuses. Avoidance. You get frustrated.
yeah.
Look at how polar opposite these responses are from offense to defense. And we're gonna show you how they hinge on a very simple thing.
Yeah, they really do. So these are behaviors. This is what we call self-censoring behavior. When you feel that you're in a defensive mode, when you're retreating, when you're withdrawing, you're managing personal risk. You're self-censoring, and we all have a self-censoring instinct. If that instinct is triggered, we go into that mode of defense. Okay. Now let me just mention one of the categories of impact, and that is how this affects learning. And think about the learning agility that we need to have in organizations today. Here's the definition of learning agility. Learning agility means that you are learning at or above the speed of change. The environment needs to foster that. But if it doesn't, then you're not going to learn as well. Here's what we know based on the research. An emotionally bruised learner. That's a learner for whom acts of vulnerability have been punished. You become emotionally bruised. When you're an emotionally bruised learner, you are a cognitively impaired learner. You cannot learn at your best, right? The learning velocity goes down. The learning effectiveness goes down. The consequences are profound. So I want you to think about that as it applies to learning, and then learning feeds performance in terms of execution and innovation, both. So let's come back to psychological safety. Here's a basic definition, and this is a definition that we're crystallizing based on the research. We define psychological safety in 5 words: an environment of rewarded vulnerability. That's what we've just been talking about. Are acts of vulnerability rewarded or punished? If they're rewarded, you are in an environment of psychological safety. That's the very definition of it, that you can engage in those acts of vulnerability and they will be rewarded. So that's psychological safety. That's the essence of the concept. Okay.
Tim,
Now let's go. Yeah, go ahead.
One of the things I wanted to point out about offensive and defensive response is that defensive response takes a lot of energy. A lot of energy. When you're talking about avoidance and personal risk management, it's really interesting that we're diverting a portion of our productive capacity, a portion of our energy, our bandwidth generally, right?
Yeah.
Emotion, we're channeling all of that into a defensive response that is not productive at all at a personal level,
Yeah.
at a team level, at an organizational level. And so you can see very quickly, just from a capacity perspective, we're so impaired when those acts of vulnerability are punished.
Yeah, we're preoccupied with that,
Yeah.
right? The pain centers of the brain have been activated, and we're preoccupied, and we can't perform at our best. So let's go into the 4 stages quickly. Most of you are probably unfamiliar with the 4 stages. This is the basic framework that has come out of our basically worldwide research. Psychological safety is a function of respect and permission. And the way that it works is that we move through these successive stages based on the sequence of human needs and escalating vulnerability. So those 2 things are happening. So stage 1 is inclusion safety, which means you feel included, accepted, and a sense of belonging. And this is always stage 1. And you proved it in the first polling question, right? This is the universal pattern. People are, that's the first thing that they want. Then we go to learner safety, which means that we feel free and able to ask questions, give and receive feedback, experiment, even make mistakes. So that's the next natural stage. Then we go to contributor safety. Contributor safety means we take what we have learned and we use it. We apply it. And there's a natural human instinct that wants to do that. We've learned, we've acquired skills and experience and knowledge. Let's go use that. That's stage 3. And then finally, we get to stage 4, which is the last, final, culminating stage, which means that you feel safe to challenge the status quo without retaliation or retribution. Now, you can see that as we move from stage to stage, right, we are climbing a ladder of vulnerability. We're climbing a ladder of vulnerability. By the time we get to stage 4, challenger safety, our level of personal exposure and risk is at the very highest level. And therefore, we need psychological safety to protect us in that behavior. So that's what we're going to focus on for the rest of this webinar today. We're going to talk about what does it take to do that. Now, let me just show you, before we go there, a couple of failure patterns. The first failure pattern is what we call paternalism. Paternalism means relatively high respect, relatively low permission. Paternalism means I'm micromanaging you, I'm holding you back, I'm patting you on the head, and I'm telling you not to touch anything. You're like a helicopter parent. A lot of well-meaning, very good people lead this way, and they stunt the growth of their people. They get in the way. So we need to be aware of and alert to patterns of paternalism. They're not healthy at all. Now, here's the second failure pattern: exploitation. Exploitation means relatively low respect, relatively high permission. I value what you're able to produce, but I don't value you. That's exploitation. And exploitation can be very mild, or it can be pretty destructive, right? So it can range from subtle public shaming to overt harassment or bullying. Right? I just finished participating in an anti-bullying conference in the UK earlier this morning with one of our global partners, Nikki Eyre, and she did a phenomenal job in putting this conference together. And we realized that this becomes most destructive when it's normalized. And so we have to be aware of this, and we have a lot of opportunity in our organizations to eliminate some of these patterns. Okay, so ultimately, here's where we're going. With stage 4, challenger safety, we're trying to do 2 things at the same time. We're trying to get intellectual friction up. We're trying to get social friction down. Intellectual friction is our raw material for innovation. So we need constructive dissent. We need creative abrasion. We need a very high tolerance for candor. We need hard-hitting dialogue and debate. But we got to keep the social friction down, which is hard to do. It normally goes up with the intellectual friction, and then it shuts down the intellectual friction. So leaders everywhere around the world, this is your job. This is your stewardship. Increase the intellectual friction, decrease the social friction. How do you do this? Doing this creates the behavior that we call intellectual bravery. Intellectual bravery is the result of high levels of psychological safety. So we're going to go through some tips. And if you have, and we want you to chime in this discussion. So here's the first tip. Number 1, take your finger off the fear button. Now, I want you to think about this for a minute. Fear for many leaders, for insecure leaders that don't know how to do the job, They use fear as a proxy for leadership, as a replacement for leadership, because they don't quite know how to lead, right? And so I want you to think about how easy it is to push the fear button. And let's go to the chat and let me ask you this question. What are some both subtle and not so subtle ways, common ways that leaders do push the fear button and they trigger the self-censoring instinct, which causes you to retreat into silence? How do people do this?
While you're putting that in the chat, guys, one of the things I want to point out is that as we go through each of these tips, it's a fantastic opportunity to be introspective. It's pretty easy for us to point out other places that we see this. We see someone push the fear button here, someone push the fear button here. Think to yourselves, when is the last time that you pushed the fear button for somebody? We all do it. And as we mentioned, some of this, perhaps much of this, is inadvertent. I think there are relatively few people out there that operate with belligerent fear, just imposing as much fear as possible in a deliberate way.
Yeah.
A lot of this is subtle, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of this is subtle, and sometimes those subtle things are what become normalized. And then we kind of creep forward, and pretty soon we're in a place that we did not intend to be, either personally or as a team or organization. So I'm going to look at some of these chats now. They give their opinion first. We're going to talk about that
We're
one.
going to talk about that one.
It's a great one.
Yeah.
Pretending to know it all, interrupting.
Interrupting. Sorry for interrupting, Junior.
No, you're totally good. Withdraw your favor.
Yeah.
Lack of empowerment. Respond aggressively to an idea. I'm guilty of that one sometimes. In my enthusiasm to advocate something, or I get enthused about something, sometimes it'll come off as aggressive and shut down. You know, that's something that I've had to work on.
So listen to this one, Junior, from Shane Kinney. He says, inactive listening. Think about how mild that is.
Oh man, so true.
You're giving someone half of your attention, but they can tell, right? And so even that very, very subtle, mild behavior can send a message and can induce a measure of fear.
Yep.
That's a good one.
Marcos says sarcasm, and I want to call that one out. That one's huge for me, because usually in some sort of sarcastic comment, there's a little dagger in there. There's a little bit of truth or a little bit of ill intent in the sarcasm, and that can be dangerous, especially if that one's normalized. And that's something that I've seen with a few different teams and organizations where new entrants into that culture get hurt by it because they're not used to it. And it can be a bad deal. And some people will say, oh, that's just the way it is around here. That's how we talk, right? Yeah. But you have to think about the effects of that getting normalized and becoming a pattern.
Yeah, that's a good one. Another one here from Danielle is just tone.
Yeah.
And tone is, it's really mild. Okay, let me ask you this though. As Junior said, we will all make mistakes in this area, and hopefully they're mild. Hopefully they're small mistakes. How do we respond to those mistakes? How should we respond? How do we recover? What have others done for you to recover that was effective? What do you think?
Acknowledge it, open and honest, admit fault and apologize, empathy, giving a second chance.
Yeah.
One of the things I want to call out here is the space in between the action and the apology. I think it's very important for us to shorten that distance as much as possible, because the longer that hangs around in the air, the worse it's going to be. And so if we can catch ourselves early and call out the behavior and say, I apologize, that was on me, own it, right?
Yeah.
I apologize. And then we change, because you can't apologize for the same thing 3,000 times.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, hold yourself accountable, call yourself out, give yourself a yellow card as soon as possible,
Yeah.
right? That's good faith. And we will make mistakes from time to time, but think about the patterns of recovery that have worked for you from others, right? And then you said, oh, it's no problem, and you're able to go forward. You're able to strengthen the relationship, maintain the productivity. So
One of the things that's worked well for me in the past that I've seen with other people is when they explain the context a little bit
yeah.
and say, hey, last night I had a really bad night. This is something that happened in my life and I'm just a little bit on edge. So I apologize. That goes a long way, just helping to understand some of those that are inadvertent.
So Junior, there was a comment here. What happens? So this is Cheryl. What happens if people refuse to apologize? So let's point out three patterns of deflection.
Yeah.
These are the primary patterns of deflection that human beings engage in when we don't want to take ownership or accountability. Number one, denial. Number two, blame. Number three, excuse. Those are what we call the three patterns of deflection. And when we don't, and we've all done this. We've all done this, and we need to try. So we're trying to eliminate this, right? But you have to be alert uh, for others to exhibit these patterns of deflection, and also in yourself. We're trying to avoid patterns of deflection. Patterns of deflection don't solve the problem, right? They just bury it or kick it down the road. So that's number one. Let's go to number two. Second pro tip here is to assign dissent. Junior, do you want to talk a little bit about what we mean by assigning dissent?
Absolutely. So, one of the dangers in organizations is groupthink, right? That can be a very, very bad thing. And often we'll enter a meeting or we'll enter a conversation and we'll say something like, we want everybody to participate. If you have any ideas, let us know. And that's how we approach the option to dissent, right? That still presents a lot of personal risk, especially depending on the environment and the culture that already exists. And so, what we're saying is instead of doing it that way, consider going into the meeting and assigning dissent and saying, Tim, your role in this meeting is to help us understand why this is a bad idea. I'm giving you permission to do that. That is your assignment. And so, all of a sudden, Tim, how do you feel now about the risk? Did it go up or down?
Risk went down.
Risk went down, right? And because it's now his assignment, he can challenge, and the team understands that too, that the dynamic changes. The team's expecting Tim to dissent. And that's often where we can get some really good ideas. And so you'll hear tiger teams, red teams, that's very aligned with this concept of assigning dissent and making sure that we choose people and saying, hey, this is your job today. We want to hear why this isn't going to work.
Yeah. Yeah. So, as Junior said, when you assign dissent, you're trading personal risk. I'm going to take your personal risk away from you by giving you institutional permission. And it makes a huge difference. But you have to do it from the beginning. From the beginning, you make the assignments. And as Junior said, it can shift the norms of the team immediately.
So Leah says, I would say it's also relevant for construction sites. Let me speak to that a little bit.
Okay.
Often in a situation like that, in a culture like that, it's very difficult from a physical safety perspective for someone to call somebody else out, right?
Yeah.
That can be a very difficult thing to do, tall order. But when we say, hey, Jane, this is your role to help us understand some of the things that we may not be doing well in this process, we want to hear about it. That's your job today. That it clears the air, it takes that risk away, at least lessens it to a big degree, and we can make some good progress.
Let me make another comment here. So think about this. When psychological safety is low and you make a mistake, what are you tempted to do with that mistake? What do people do with mistakes?
Throw it in the chat.
They hide it. They hide it. Now, I want you to think about how costly that is. Our mistakes are the clinical material of learning in an organization. So we are not using that clinical material. That clinical material is being hidden and pushed aside. So think about what that does to the organization. We're not using the clinical material of learning, of organizational learning, because we're hiding the mistakes. That's so costly, right? It's amazing. Let's go to number three.
Especially when we're talking about things like healthcare, right? A
Yeah,
few of you pointed that out in the chat.
that's right.
Um, some of these things have very, very big
They
consequences.
do. They do.
Yeah.
Here's the third pro tip for today. Encourage people to think beyond their roles. I want you to think about how we come up in organizations. We come up usually in some functional area, in some narrow role, performing tasks with a circumscribed job description. So there's a few things that we do, and we get good at that, but it's a tactical mindset. The problem is that the organization comes around after it comes around after a while, and it taps us on the shoulder and it says, "Hey, we want you to think strategically." The problem is you haven't been asking me to think strategically since I started at this organization. So the traditional socialization is extremely task oriented and tactical. The problem with that is that we need people. So go ahead and act in your roles. But what we're suggesting is that we need to encourage people very early on in their careers to think beyond their roles. That's how they develop. That's how they develop systems level thinking, strategic level thinking, what Howard Gardner calls searchlight intelligence, to be able to see the big picture. So we need to encourage that, not when you're well into your career, but from the beginning. Even if you're doing a very narrow set of tasks, we need to encourage people to think beyond their roles. So let me ask you, were you encouraged to think beyond your role when you were early in your career? What was the pattern? How were you encouraged to think? This is interesting, isn't it? No, but I did anyway. Right?
Yeah,
Okay,
that's the
fantastic.
exception.
Yeah.
I had an experience like this. I was in a relatively junior role on an engineering team, and we were doing a very complex software implementation with several different countries, locations in several different countries. And the leader that was probably 3 above me in the hierarchy, we had a one-on-one, and he asked me, "Hey, can you help me understand what I missed on this? Is there anything that you've seen that we missed?" I'm like, "What are you asking me for? That's not my job." No, it's absolutely your job. You have a different view of the organization than I do, and I'm interested in your opinion, right?
Yeah.
Wow. So that by the time, I get to the next level and the next level, I'm equipped to contribute in that way because that's been the pattern of my experience.
Yeah, it really has. And by the way, so Ben, if you could put the link in. So I published an article in Forbes yesterday about smashing the psychological barriers to innovation. And we talk about this. We have to cultivate this systems level thinking from the earliest possible opportunity in our careers. And if we get down the road and we come late to the game and we say, we want you to think strategically, we want you to help us innovate, it's traumatic because they haven't done it. These are muscle groups that have gotten no exercise in the past. And so, but if we do nurture that from the beginning, we're creating psychological safety, which says, yes, work in your role, but you are at liberty, you're free. In fact, we encourage you to think beyond your role because we're trying to optimize the whole. We're not trying to optimize one part of the whole. That's what leadership is all about. So if we cultivate this early in people's careers, it makes a huge difference.
Sure does. Let's go to the next one.
Okay.
We've got respond constructively to disruptive ideas and bad news. I love this one. And this is one that takes practice. This is one that requires us to think beforehand how we will respond to situations like this, because it's very difficult in the moment without practice to respond constructively to very bad news, right? And so think about this. What does this mean? Think about the times in your life where leaders or people in your life, in any capacity, have responded poorly to bad news or disruptive ideas.
Yeah.
How did you feel coming away from that experience? And what are some things that we do to respond negatively to disruptive ideas? We've talked about a few of them. Tone is one, rolling our eyes is one. I know in my experience, when someone has come with a disruptive idea and I'm in the middle of something, I don't give it the attention that it maybe deserves, right? And what does that tell the person that brought that idea to me? He's not that interested. The next time an idea comes to that person, are they more or less inclined to come share it with me? Much less,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And if we do that over and over again, pretty sure I'm going to have no ideas on my table, nothing coming across my desk, and it will be status quo forever. And so the way we respond to these types of things is incredibly important.
Yeah. We're basically signaling to our people if dissent is welcome or if it's unwelcome. And we signal that in our emotional response, in our nonverbal cues, right? People understand very, very quickly, oh, this is welcome or this is not welcome. It goes back to what we said. Particularly is dissent is because this could be an act of 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 intellectual bravery, right? It could be an act of vulnerability. Is it going to be rewarded or punished? So people, these are the signals that people watch for very, very closely. If you can accommodate this, if you can accommodate disruptive ideas and bad news in your emotional intelligence, you're going to draw your people out, and they will perform probably at levels that you never thought possible. That's what you can do.
Christina said, remember it's a teaching moment and thank them. That's a very simple thing that you can do, is say thank you. Hey, thanks for that idea. I appreciate that. Thank you for pointing that out. That makes a big difference.
It really does. And this next tip is related to the prior tip. When you reject feedback, so right, someone brings you a disruptive idea, but you end up not accepting it or applying it or implementing it. So you don't use it. When you reject feedback, explain why. Right? So as we say in the article, your considerate response will make it more likely that the individual will continue giving the feedback. So you may not use it, but the person needs to be validated in the act of providing that feedback. And that's what nurtures it, right?
Yeah, I like that one a lot. One of the questions we have in the chat, suggestions to better respond positively while working from home. A couple suggestions. I think it might be worth talking about this a little bit now.
Yeah.
I think tone is even more important than it perhaps ever has been, because sometimes we don't have more to go on. Sometimes that's the only thing. I would encourage everybody to use video as much as possible, because right now, if you watch me speaking, I'm using my hands, right? And I'm smiling or I'm frowning or I might look concerned. That gives you a whole bunch more feedback than if I go off camera. So if I stop my video and I keep talking, there's much less for you to go on, right?
Yeah.
So if I throw this on, much better. So I would encourage you to do that as much as possible when you're doing something like this. I had an instance where I rejected some feedback pretty recently in the last couple of days, and I felt that it was so helpful to convey my sincerity and trying to be genuine in rejecting this feedback with just having a video call instead of sending a message on Slack. I've been really fast and just saying, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to do this. 5 minutes, not even 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and just hopping on video saying, hey, just wanted to touch base on this. We've thought through it, and for this reason and this reason and this reason, we think that this is the best path forward. But thank you so much for your input, and we would like your input moving forward in this way. It makes all the difference, and it really doesn't take that much time.
Very true. Yeah. And to Junior's point, think about how we're restricted, how we're handicapped. So you see us from kind of the neck up mostly, and you're reliant upon uh, vocal characteristics, facial expressions, a little bit of gesturing with hands, but we don't have any more, right?
Yeah.
This is the world of a distributed workforce. We need to compensate for that, don't we?
Yeah.
In a lot of ways. Yeah. Okay. Here's the next one. Number 6, weigh in last. Junior, do you want to address this one a little bit?
Yeah, this is one of my favorites, and one of the ones that I'm probably guilty of not doing the most. So let me just read this one. I think it's good. Speaking first when you hold positional power softly censors your team. I love that sentence. Listen carefully, acknowledge the contributions of others, and then register your point of view, taking into account what others have already said. What's the tendency? What's the tendency of leaders to go into a meeting and weigh in first and set the stage? And by doing that, I love the way we say softly censors your team. Sometimes it's not soft, but it often is. And so what we can do is go in, let the meeting play out, right? Let someone else lead the meeting. Step back, observe what's going on, let people discuss, take all of that in, and then you can give your point of view. And sometimes we may not even need your point of view in the meeting, right? You don't necessarily always have to weigh in. And so I would even say sometimes don't weigh in. Let the team do some of the work. Let the team do most of the work or all of the work, depending on the situation. And if you need to get in there, then do it later.
Junior, so we're one of the client. We're working with a Fortune 500 client, a CEO and his team right now. And this CEO, he's one of the best that I've ever worked with in my career. And we do everything virtually, right, with his team. And the other day we were having this very vigorous discussion and debate, and he jumped in there. He's extremely bright and he's pretty aggressive, but he's also very kind and empathetic. And he just caught himself and he said, "Oh, sorry, I'm going to listen." He caught himself, and I can't tell you just the reaction in all the other members of the executive team. They just, you could see it on their faces. They were saying to themselves, "Oh, well, this is wonderful." He's showing that respect,
Yeah.
and he's setting the tone for that mutual respect that needs to become the norm on our team. And it was just a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
So we sometimes we need to rein yourself in, and if particularly if you're the person in charge, if you hold positional power, you go last, right? You go last. Yeah.
Excellent.
Here's the last one, Junior.
Model vulnerability. Remember that vulnerability is exposing yourself to the possibility of harm or loss. And we talked about this at the very beginning, that vulnerability does not have to be this big, risky, overt thing all of the time. Vulnerability can be very subtle, and it can be a little bit or a lot. And one of the things that we need to do to encourage that from other people is to model it, because human beings are very much about reciprocity. And we're also looking at the environment all the time. We're scanning, we're looking for threats. And me, if I'm especially in a position of positional power, showing some vulnerability goes a long way. So if Tim comes into a meeting in which he's the subject matter expert and says something like, "I actually didn't know that. That's really interesting." Or, "Tell me something that you've learned in the last week." Or, "I did this thing last week and I thought it was the best decision and it didn't turn out very well," right?
Yeah.
Those types of things show the team, wow, this is a human being. This is a fallible, authentic human being who makes mistakes, who learns. I think learning is a huge one when we're talking about learner safety, to show that there is vulnerability in the learning process, even when you're an expert. I think that is huge. Share your mistakes, ask exploratory questions, admit what you don't know.
Yeah.
That goes a long way with people.
Yeah. And if you don't do that, right, then everybody already knows what you're unwilling to communicate, which is that you're human. So when you do communicate that you're human through your own vulnerability, it's extremely refreshing. Thank you for acknowledging that you're one of us, right? And that you're not hiding behind the artifacts of title, position, and authority, because that doesn't help. It just doesn't help. So that's the final tip. Okay, so those are the 7 tips, and I want to conclude with a thought about the stewardship of a leader. And it doesn't matter really whether you hold a formal managerial role or whether you're an individual contributor. But I want to mention this to you. Encouraging psychological safety isn't easy. It requires a high level of emotional intelligence and a highly controlled ego. But arguably, your most important job is what? It's to nourish a context in which people are given air cover in exchange for candor. That's how you get all the way to stage 4, challenger safety. That's how you foster intellectual bravery, which is the behavioral consequence of having that kind of environment. So that's what we want to do. That's my parting thought. Junior, how about you?
I think that my parting thought would be part of my introduction, which is let's be introspective. As we go through these tips, as we think about psychological safety, let's be very slow to point out how others are doing a poor job of creating psychological safety, and very fast to look at the ways that we personally can improve. I think that that's the best way to go about this, especially when we talk about in groups and out groups. Very often we're saying, oh, you're doing a poor job, or this group is doing a poor job, and everyone is doing a poor job. But why can't we say, I'm seeing some progress here? And me personally, man, I push the fear button all the time, and I need to stop doing that. I think that is probably my parting thought. It's my parting thought for myself. Leaving these webinars, I'm always, trying to put into practice what we preach. And as you can imagine, it's a tall order, given this is what we teach people all the time. And so that's what I'm going to try and do leaving today.
And I agree with that, Junior. Hopefully we're introspective first, and that really follows the progression of leadership. Lead yourself first, lead the team second, lead the organization. So leadership always begins in the inner world, doesn't it? It always begins with ourselves. So with that, let me just mention, well, Junior, maybe you can mention the behavioral guide.
Absolutely. So I'll have Ben put a link to the behavioral guide in the chat in just a second. So the behavioral guide is a practical how-to resource to improve psychological safety. We talked about the 4 stages: inclusion safety, learner safety, contributor safety, and challenger safety. We have 30 to 40 behaviors that you can implement to improve psychological safety in each of those stages. So if you find, wow, challenger safety is really low on my team, or I wish we had some more inclusion, the 7 tips that we shared today are just part of what are 130 or 140 behaviors, just like those, very practical. One of the things that we're most interested in doing is translating from theory into practice. We are about action. We are about making real progress, because we know that all of you out there work on real teams and are part of real social collectives. And we would like to help you and partner with you in improving the situation. We find that these behaviors have impact not just at the organizational level, but at the personal and career level. And so I would encourage you to download the behavioral guide. It's completely free from us to you, to help the world increase psychological safety, because we very much need it. So go ahead and do that. A couple other things that I wanted to mention before we hop off here. Again, the book, you can find it on Amazon. You can download a book summary if you want to just learn a little bit more about it on our website, leaderfactor.com. We will be in touch about the next webinar. We do these webinars every 2 or 3 weeks. And we'll probably do about one more before the end of the year. So keep an eye out for that invitation. As I mentioned, we opened up 2 more certification dates for the 4 stages of psychological safety. A really cool way to engage in what we're doing and become certified to deploy training in the area of psychological safety with all of our facilitator resources, as well as become an admin inside the 4 stages platform. So we're going to shift for the last 2 or 3 minutes from webinar, free content, and I'm going to show you what we're doing in the area of psychological safety on the platform. So if you don't want to stick around for that, no problem at all. We hope you enjoyed the session. If you do want to stick around for 2 or 3 minutes, I'll just show you briefly what the platform can do and what comes with this certification. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Tim, anything else before I do that? Tim, I think you're muted.
Okay. I wanted to say one more thing on a personal note, and that is, as you know, we're going through this pandemic, and we've had a surge of infections in our neck of the woods, and probably many of you have too. For example, my son, my high school age son, he's been able to go to school every other day for a half a day. Now they can't even do that. So we're in a pressurized environment. We're being disrupted. It looks like we're going back down into lockdown to a certain extent. So I want you to think about this context, right? This environment. It calls for greater civility, greater empathy, greater compassion as we interact and work together. That's what it calls for. That's really what we owe to each other, especially in a pressurized situation such as this. So I just wanted to mention that to you. And the extent to which we can do that, it makes a big difference as we're working with each other. Junior, back to you.
You got it. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Tim, can you see that?
Yep.
Excellent. So this is the 4 stages team survey platform. If you're interested in measuring psychological safety in a quantitative and qualitative way on your team or organization, this is how you do it based on the 4 stages model. And so the first thing that happens is we send out invitations to the intact team level, and we ask them to respond to a 12-item survey with a few open-ended comments. They get that in their inbox. We use an 11-point scale. They can respond on any device. They click through this and they submit it. You'll notice that the questions, the items are very simple. I'm encouraged to contribute as much as I can in my role. I can take reasonable risks without being punished. These are the types of things we're asking people. Very straightforward. And then we ask them some qualitative questions. What is one thing that prevents you from feeling included, safe to learn, safe to contribute, safe to challenge the status quo? And then you get all of this out in a readout on a dashboard that looks like this, with overall score, stage averages, question averages, rank ordered by score, filterable by stage. We give teams top 3 opportunities along with recommendations. Again, moving from theory to practice very quickly. So this team, for example, scored low here. I feel comfortable asking questions. We're going to recommend that they ask from help from those of lower status, ask questions to activate learning, incorporate a daily learning segment. And the behavioral guide goes in tandem with this to provide some additional recommendation. Results over time. You can measure your team more than once over time. And each time you do, a new set of nodes appears on this chart, and you can track by the 4 stages and by overall score. And then the open-ended comments are listed down here. The behavioral guide that I mentioned is in here as well in digital format. So you can click on a stage, look at a definition, and look at all of these behaviors. Ask for bad news. We talked about that today. Tee up, challenge the status quo questions. Praise quantity over quality in brainstorming. Very actionable things. The certification allows you admin access to this platform, which we would highly encourage you to look into. You get additional resources, handouts, full workshop presentations and slide decks, the behavioral guide in PDF format, the 5P action planner, branding, we co-brand, and the facilitator guide. We do aggregate reporting, which I won't go into now because we've just got a couple minutes left, but really neat things that you can do. Even if you're a very large multinational, the reporting functionality inside the platform is awesome. We're GDPR compliant. We've got multiple languages. We do the development in-house, and so we operate on 2-week sprints. The cost to run the survey itself is $25 per respondent. The certification is $1,000 US, and we've opened sessions for January and February. I think we've got 2 dates. We tried to do an Australia friendly and a UK friendly in terms of time zones, which should appeal to a bunch of different time zones aside from those, but just to give people some options. So there's a video over on that page, leaderfactor.com/certifications, to learn a little bit more about it. But this is what we're doing in the space of psychological safety. If you're interested in joining our global network, it's a growing network and is becoming increasingly valuable. We're at the cutting edge of what we're doing in psychological safety. So if you're not interested in the certification and you've still hung around, we would encourage you to subscribe or follow our LinkedIn page. That's where we post tons of free content. We'll keep you up to date with what we're doing. We post about the upcoming webinars and everything else that we have going on. So head over to LinkedIn, search Leader Factor, give us a follow, and that will keep you up to speed with what we've got going on. We're a minute over, so I'm going to close this out and just say thank you. Thank you for spending an hour of your time with us today. We appreciate you and the influence that you're having in the world. We find that people opt into sessions like this because they care about people. They care about humanity, and we're confident that that is probably you on the other side of this camera. So from me to you, from Leader Factor to you, thank you so much for being here and for everything that you do. We are here as a resource for you and will continue to contribute to the community. So with that, Tim, I'll turn it over to you, and thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
All right.
Have a great
Thanks,
day,
guys.
everybody. We'll see you soon.
We'll catch you in the next one.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.